I'm Shawn, this is Renae.
And you are? I'm Tony and this is Dave.
Nice to meet you.
This is Doc.
Oh,
Doc.
everybody knows that.
Yeah, everybody knows them.
This is Cousin Clay.
Okay.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Timers.
Yeah.
This is a new one too.
Uh-huh.
Julie, it's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Julie.
Julie? What? To what?
Well, we're pretty laid back, you know, we're going to just be talking back and forth. She's going to be talking, then I might chime in and she'll pick up where I left off. So we run a school called Native Studies. Anyways, we're going to be talking about...
Well, we were talking about giving a deal on healing, and we were going back and forth over this past month trying to figure what would be a good thing to talk about. We were thinking about, you know, doing some salves and tinctures and stuff like that for a while, but I started thinking probably most of you are never going to make a salve or a tincture, and those that do probably already are. So there's something that I think you guys could use a whole lot more often in everyday life for healing purposes, because you do it all the time anyway, and especially Doc.
He's a master at it.
So that is using storytelling for healing. And this is something, all of you are full of stories, and you do it all the time anyway, but this will help give you some tools to kind of fine-tune it and actually be able to use it a whole lot better. So let's start off with a story. This is an old story. Happened a long time ago. There was this little village, and there was two women that lived on the outskirts of the village. And they got into an argument one day. They were going back and forth over which one of them was more beautiful. And so finally they decided that there was one way that they could settle this. They would walk through the village one at a time and see who had more friends than the other. So Truth, she decided she was going to go first. And she went down through the village and she started to walk through. And she's just walking along down a little main street there, and everybody starts shying away from her. You know, nobody talks to her. They just kind of shy away. Some of them even went inside their houses, closed their shutters. And so she got all the way to the end of the village, and nobody had talked to her. She thought, well, what can I do to make myself more attractive? So she took her robe off, and she walked naked back down the street. This time, everybody, the last few people who were out in the streets went inside and closed their doors. So she got back to the end, you know, and yeah, well, that didn't work. So then Story went next. And as soon as she stepped into the village, everybody came out of their houses, started gathering around her. Even the people started gathering in groups amongst themselves and talking amongst themselves. And so by the time she got to the middle of the village, the entire village was out there around her, talking and laughing. And so then she turned around and she came back out and came to where Truth was sitting there at the edge of the village. And Truth said, well, I guess you won, you know, I guess Story is more powerful than Truth. And Truth said, no, it's not that. It's just that nobody really likes the truth, and especially not the naked truth. Oh. She said, what you need is the mantle of Story. And so she took off her beautiful robe and she wrapped it around Truth's shoulders, and Truth walked back into the village. And this time everybody came out and surrounded her, because this time they could hear what she had to say. Everybody in this world has a story. Our world is made up of stories. And they're all interconnected. There's trillions of stories out there. It's not just us. Every plant, every animal, every rock. The rocks have the oldest stories. And, you know, people talk about somebody having a pet rock personality. I'd rather talk to the Rock. It's got a lot more interesting stories. It's been there a long time. Everybody has thousands of stories within them, and they're all interconnected. Your story is interconnected with every other person on earth through the few hundred people that you know during your lifetime. And once you hear someone's story, you become a part of their story. When someone tells you a story, then you become a part of it. You influence it. And when it gets told to the next person, it has something of you in it. So healing through storytelling, everybody knows that it can be very healing just to tell a story and get it off your chest, but it goes a whole lot deeper than that. Some of you probably remember the medicine wheel that we did here. And for those of you that weren't here for that, a medicine wheel is found through cultures all throughout the world. And sometimes you'll be going out across the landscape and you'll find a circle of stones laid on the ground. And when you do, it's best to just let it be. It was put there for a purpose. And a lot of people think, ceremonies, they get the concept of people dancing, around it or something. It's not for that. It was to conceptualize our stories, our life, to see where our place was. Because you had a circle, and at various points around that circle, you had points that represented the directions. You have north. And then you move a little bit further, you have south, east, south, west. And the east represented a lot of things. It was spring. It was the morning time. It's youth. That time period when you're a young child. It has colors that it represents. But at some point, it not just within your life, but every undertaking that you have to start somewhere. You have to start there in the east. And every quarter direction, you have to have a rite of passage to go through that in order to completely understand it and fulfill it.
Get the marker.
It's in my pocket.
I didn't know if we left it in the car.
So, as you move around and you start coming into the south, you have more of your middle life, 30s to 40s. This is the summertime. This is a time of strength. It's high noon. It's the heat of the day. It is a time of great energy, a time of great strength. It's when your body is its strongest. And it's a time of hard work. This is when you are building up your family, your home, and you are starting to, you're raising your children, you're building a life for the future. It's a time when you're starting to mature, but you've not yet turned that maturity into wisdom. Then as you move on and you come to the southwest, this is a time when you're transitioning. This is a time of a rite of passage into mental wisdom. And it's there that a lot of people will find their midlife crisis. It's there that women will go through menopause. Menopause is looked on nowadays a lot of times as, something you don't want to go through, but it was a transition into the crone, into the wise woman. And the same for the men. When the men start to become that elder that you go to, they're starting to turn knowledge into wisdom. And then when you come into the west, this is autumn. This is a time when things are starting to cool down. They're starting to slow down. It's a time when all the fruits are ripe, when your children have grown up, they're starting to mature, and now then you can talk to them one-on-one. They're starting to understand you. They're no longer resisting you, but they're starting to work with you. And that's when your fruits have ripened. It's a time of harvest. When you start moving around through the northwest and into the north, you come into the time of the storyteller. This is winter. This is time when the elders' hair is turned white like snow, and their bones start to feel cold like the winter. It is a time of wisdom. And it is the time when families draw in close, and they draw in close around the fire, and that wisdom is passed on through story. This is a hero's journey. Every one of you are on a hero's journey. And it may not feel like it at the time, but just the process of birth itself is a hero's journey in and of itself, and it has this wheel within it. It has that starting space. Here in the northeast, this place right here, this quarter direction, is the place of birth and of death, where those who have lived go back to where they came from, and those who are about to live come from that place, and their paths cross. From there, until they leave the womb, they go through this cycle. And during your life, you will find patterns of the hero's journey within your own story. That time when you have to leave your village or your home, the time when you have to step out, you're called on that journey. And it can happen many times during your lifetime. But when you come into the South, that is when you meet your dragons. You stand up to them. And you either fight and kill them, or you stand and make peace with them, and they turn into a flower or a butterfly. And then, as you complete your journey, all this that you learned here, you bring back to the village. The hero always returns to his starting place. He leaves, he goes, he conquers, he finds the grail, he brings it back. And he brings back that wisdom that he learned on that journey to his people. And he tells his story. And within that story is all these grains of wisdom for those who have the ears to hear. You will find within that story, your story, you'll find flow, you'll find patterns, and you'll find rhythms. And these are very important. These can be critical places, or they can be points that tell you where you should go with your life. Because that's what the medicine wheel was about. Conceptualizing, what are we here for? When you're in the middle of a situation, it can be a bad situation, and you're thinking, why is this happening to me? What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go from here? You're too close to it. This allows you to see outside yourself that that's normal. You're just at one of these points along the wheel. It'll shift. Things will go on. It'll keep cycling. Where are you on that wheel? Have you missed a place? Is all of this turmoil happening because you jumped from this place of birth in a relationship, or in a job. You jumped from that starting place and went right into the south, to that place of hard work, of stress, of labor, of the need for strength, and you skipped this area, this place of enjoyment, of childhood, of innocence. And maybe you have to go back and relive that place so that you can complete the circle, close that loop. So it gives you something, a tool that you can see outside of yourself and see where you are on that place. And those patterns, those rhythms, if you have ever heard a really good storyteller tell stories, especially the old ones, the way people used to tell the old Aesop's fable kind of stories, you notice that there would be a rhythm to it, a flow, to where certain key phrases or certain happenings or certain words would be repeated at certain intervals. And it made it into a song, because that's all this is. Our life is one big song. And those key phrases, though, they're important, and they'll pop up in your life. Certain things where people, maybe they always came to you for advice, or maybe animals always came to you. You always had a gift with animals. And maybe you are working as an accountant. Maybe you're having all the stress in your life. If you go back through and you look for the patterns, what has always been there? And you find out, well, maybe I should have been a vet. You know, maybe this is where I need to be. We're constantly living stories and asking for stories. Anytime, what's the first thing you do when you meet somebody? You say, hey, how have you been? You're asking for a story. And they reply, oh, this happened. How have you been? They're asking for your story back. What part of the story has transpired since we last met? We're constantly telling stories back and forth. But being able to pinpoint, understand them, and use them to help people heal is a great gift. It's one that used to be a sacred art. Every village had their storyteller. That's what they did. They preserved the knowledge of the tribe. They preserved their history. The bards, they went around the countryside telling stories. It was stories kind of like the story of truth and story. It had a very interesting lesson that meant something to them. So what the wheel does when you apply it like this is it allows you to go into your subconscious, your right hemisphere, where it's hard to conceptualize some of these things that happens in life, but this allows us to dive into that deep pool of the subconscious and the emotions where we store a lot of our memories and a lot of our pain. In cultures all over the world, the Chinese, the Mayans, the Indians from India, they all had very sophisticated systems of healing. And one of the many things that is common between all of them is the idea that we store emotions within our body in different places, and specific emotions in specific organs. They believe that hate was stored in the liver. And I guarantee you, you find someone who has a lot of hate in them, a lot of resentment in them, their liver's the first thing to go. Fear will tear up the kidneys.
Jealousy, the heart.
Jealousy, envy, and guilt will destroy the heart. A healer, and all of you are healers at some point or other. A healer is kind of like a spider. It sits with the patient in this web and listens. A healer's greatest tool is their ability to listen on many levels. And the spider sits there, the healer sits there, and finds where the strand has been broken that is causing this illness. Because that is all that illness is, and it's not the symptom. Let's go over real quick what happens when a good, really good storyteller tells a story. You start out, you have the teller, and you have the listeners. They're coming together here, and the teller begins to create an entity for his listeners.
That is a story.
The story becomes an entity if it's told correctly. Story was originally, words were originally meant to verbalize in a way, conceptualize, communicate emotion. What was going on inside you. Now then, our words have become disconnected from their original meanings. We can say something and it doesn't transmit because we don't put the passion behind it. But for a storyteller who relives and envisions his story, even if he never lived through it or she never lived through it to begin with, maybe it's not their story, maybe they're telling somebody else's. But if they can tap into that story and they project that passion, they envision as they're telling the story, it's not something that's just chicken scratch on a page. It's happening there in front of them. They see it, they feel the emotions of those people, and they see it happening. They are creating an entity there. But yet they're still separate at this point. The teller's just starting this. He's starting this process. As you go along, then, the teller will begin to merge with the story as well as the listeners. Whenever you play two musical notes simultaneously, what happens? It creates a third, right? Harmonic. Everyone is resonating at their own frequency. Everything that has happened to them, all their organs within their body, their health or their illness, everything creates their own special keynote. And whenever two people come together, it creates a third harmonic. It's called keeper. When this room right now, everyone in here is creating a harmonic put together. It is a keeper. If one, now I want you to notice the difference in this keeper when Doc comes back in.
The energy.
The energy will completely change. Our keeper will change. Our harmonic will change. Because he's bringing in another keynote. His special story just left the room. when it comes back, it will completely change this harmonic, this keeper, and the way that you view the story.
Thank you, Doc.
So, the teller is beginning to get into a story. You know, you've seen somebody start out, they're starting to tell their story, and then they start to really get into it. They start to merge with that creation that they've made there. And the listeners, they're starting to connect in with the teller. They're not really into the story yet, but that teller sure is interesting to watch, you know, because he's so into the story. So they're joined with the teller, and the teller is joined in with the story. Now, at some point, if it's told right, something interesting will happen. The listeners will join. Story's still out there, but the listeners have joined. Just like sitting in a movie theater. I don't know if you've ever noticed it or not, but everybody in there is starting to be drawn in to this central place, and you start connecting to those people sitting next to you. You're starting out on a journey together, because this process of the story, just like the wheel, it's a journey. When you tell somebody a story, you're taking them on a journey. And all of the people start joining together. Then comes the point of the real magic. For the listeners overlap, and the teller overlaps them. But then they become completely surrounded by story. This is a place of magic. It's a place of an altered state of consciousness. Have you ever watched a movie or heard somebody telling a story to where you're so into it that nothing else matters? Everything else is blocked out. Where if somebody were to come into the room, come up beside you and go like that, it's, what? And you're shocked back into reality. Because you weren't in reality. You were in a different reality. You were within that entity, that story, so much. You were living it. If that happens, and someone gets snapped out of it, at this point, you're still together enough that the teller can shoot you straight back here. That's why these lines coming into the circle shoot you straight back here without having to go through this process again. And it's right here where the greatest healing can take place. We'll get back to that a little bit more in a minute. But starting now to tell the end of the story. What happens is that the teller, he knows where the story's going, even if he's making it up or whether it's a true story. End. But the teller must emerge first. He starts to move out of the story. You start to move towards that happily ever after stage. Then, at the end, you go back to the way it was, right over here. The listeners begin to separate, and the story moves out here. And they lived happily ever after. And then you're brought back to your starting place, where you began. And this is a very important part of the story, because you're being taken on a journey. How many of you would like to get into a car for a long trip with somebody that you didn't know? You have to, in order to get to here, you have to trust the one telling the story. You have to trust that they're not taking you for a ride. They're giving you something of value, but also that they are going to bring you home. If you get left somewhere in here, still connected, and the story just ends.
Who likes
don't
to
know.
be continued?
Yeah.
Anybody like to be continued? No? Yeah, I don't either.
So
That's what we're talking about.
at that point, if the story just ends and you don't find out what happened, you know? Did they get married? Did they live happily ever after? Did, she drink the vial of poison or whatever story it is that you're reading, What happened there? It's an open loop. And you're still left hanging here. You're still connected. Somewhat to each other, but more so to the teller. And this is something that people will use a lot of times because you're still connected to them. You're still bound to them in a certain way. People, it's part of our nature. We want to know how something ends. We've been doing this for thousands of years, Our ancestors have been telling stories. We know how stories should go. They should have an ending. It gives us some amount of peace, the same way it does within our own life, to know how is it going to end? Or what just happened in this little piece of my life that I just played out? What was the ending to it? It gives us a certain amount of peace to close that loop. And if you leave it open, then there's a sense of anxiety. And a teller can feed on that anxiety.
That's where a lot of control and manipulation will come in relationships. Fights that suddenly get stopped and there's no ending, there's no definitive ending, and everybody's left wondering, okay, now what? And anxiety builds. And oh no, not another confrontation, or whatever the case may be.
A lot of times in fights, you'll see people that they'll just, in the middle of the fight, okay, whatever, and they'll turn around and walk off. Wait a minute, that didn't solve anything. It's going to come up again, because they still got you latched in. But going back around to here, so you've been the storyteller all this time. And you can tell stories that will help people, stories that have a lesson to them, and can be just what they need to hear to make something click. Oh man, that makes sense. I can apply that to my life, Or you can take them in that journey, and when you have them and yourself completely surrounded by that story, a lot of healing can take place. But remember, the healer's greatest asset is their ability to listen. So switch it. You're no longer the teller. You are the listener. And the listener is the healer. And the teller is the patient. And you go through the same process. The listener begins to draw in and become a part of that patient as they tell their story. The story's still out there a little ways. You're not completely into it. Right now, you're more focused on the patient. But then, at some point, if you allow yourself, you will become completely enveloped within their story. And at that point, you'll know things that you won't know why you know them. You'll get flashes. You'll see things, you'll know things, or maybe you'll have questions for them that you don't quite know where that question came from. They'll say, yeah, that is what happened. And again, right there, that's where the most healing can take place. There's a lot of different ways to heal at that point. You can use what you find there then to more efficiently address their needs. So let's just take this and step back for a minute and apply it to a quasi real life situation. So you've got a young man in his 30s comes to you and says, either you're a doctor, maybe you're just a friend, and he says, I'm having chest pains, I've got arrhythmia, I don't know what the deal is. I'm too young to be having these kind of problems. So, at this point, most allopathic healers would stop right there and say, oh, okay, heart issues, I've got a medicine for that. And they're addressing the symptoms. They're not addressing the cause. What is it caused by? You question him a little bit more then, and you find out he's got a good diet, he exercises, no family history of heart problems whatsoever. What is the source? What is the story behind this? So as you're talking to him, you find out, how long have you been having this? He says, about 6 months. You talk to him a little bit more. You find out that his mother died about a year before. Grief, right? Can affect the heart. Anyone that's lost somebody, they know how much that can affect them. You can feel it tangibly. It can hurt physically. So a lot of holistic healers even, they'll stop there and they'll think, oh, that's the cause, grief. Okay, we can work with this. Grief will dissipate with time, maybe some flower essences or something like this. But then the storyteller, he doesn't stop there, because the storyteller is here. He's inside that story, and he knows there's something more that you're not telling me. And it may be that it's too painful to say. It could be even that they don't even remember what the real problem was. They could have blocked it out. The real problem did not come from the fact that his mother had died, but it came from the fact that at the funeral he overheard someone say it was his fault his mom died, he was never there for her. That's the true source. It's not grief, it's guilt.
Or
And
they might have had a fight before she died.
Guilt is a whole lot more damaging than grief. Grief will heal with time. Guilt is always there. It always nags. You never let it go. This is where you break down what happens within your story. There's modification points throughout your story. In that little section in between the beginning and end, you have these points where things are about to change. You have critical points. These are times of conflict, and these can be the most important. You have power points, and this is where everything comes to a head. His mother dying was a critical point. It was a time of conflict, but it was not the power point, which was, well, actually, the other way around. It was the power point. It was that time when everything came together, but the critical point was that point of conflict when he overheard that. Another one was when his mother had asked him to stay with him and he couldn't. He had work to do. These are two critical points that are leading in. They're exacerbating the problem. He could have gotten over his mother's death, It's these little points that you may even forget about. You may forget that you heard it, but it's still there. And it's those points that you can focus on to heal. The fact that his mom died is there. You're not going to change that. But how he views his relationship with his mother while she was alive, you can reframe in a different context than what he is currently viewing it as. How he views that statement made by that individual, you can change. You can help them to change. You can, through a lot of different ways, you can have them to tell their story, write it down on paper, because he wasn't there for his mom. He wasn't there when she died. It's an open loop. He never got to finish it. He never got to say goodbye. So write out that story and finish it the way that you would like to have seen it play out.
And have him relive it as if he's actually experiencing it.
Yes.
The memory is a moldable thing, and that's why nowadays a lot of eyewitness testimonies are actually discarded in court, because it has been proven in the field of psychology that memories can be manipulated and changed to fit whatever somebody wants, whatever they feel is more convenient. And it's a coping mechanism for grief and being able to move on in their survival situation.
And they may still know what actually happened, but creating that entity, making it real inside them, reliving it, going in and writing out, how would I like to see this play out? She may still die, but I'll be there with her. What would I say? How would it, the best possible way that this story could end? Write it out. That is a very strong healing tool. Sometimes there are stories that you don't really, there's no way really of changing them. These stories, oftentimes it helps to write them out and then to burn them. It's symbolic, but you destroy that. You clean it out of you. You put it onto paper. It is important because writing can be sort of like basket making. The Navajo, they do not allow, the women will not make a basket for a certain period of time after they have lost a loved one, because they know that all that grief that they're feeling will go into a basket. And if you've ever made a simple fork and weft over and under basket, you'll know that you can go out and you can be feeling crummy that day, and you pick up that basket and you start that rhythm. It's slow, it's easy, it's a circle. You're going around it. And by the time you're finished, you feel clean of everything that you felt was in that basket. And someone who's sensitive, if they pick up that basket, they'll know. But shaman were oftentimes represented by the basket, because the basket gets its most important function by being empty, being open to receive. And that's exactly what it does when you're making it. You fill it, and it leaves you like the basket then. You're empty, you're clean. So you can make a basket, and you can take it and you can burn it. Makes you kind of wonder, when you see around some of these old villages, these old ruins, you see these high mounds that are just nothing but old bits of broken pottery. And they say, yeah, that was their junkyard. You really think the natives had a junkyard? They made use of everything since on those mounds. They were places of cleansing. They were a junkyard, all right. They were a junkyard for trash inside.
That can be done also with just about anything. Baskets are extremely powerful, but anything that you create is the same way. We have a friend of ours, there's a lot of stories out there about people who get heart transplants or cornea transplants, whatever the case may be, and they start exhibiting habits of the person's personality, their likes, food preferences, music preferences change to what the person who is a donor, went to, what they like. We have a friend of ours that came up to us and said, I have a friend of mine who's having a problem. Will you talk to him? We said, sure. I mean, what's the deal? And he goes, he's been to every doctor, every psychologist, and he's on the verge of suicide because he gets no more than 30 minutes of sleep at night. He had a cornea transplant, and all he knows was that the person he got it from was an FBI agent. And he has nightmares that are so bad that he wakes up sweating. He's making mistakes at work. He's almost getting hurt a couple times, and he's about at his wit's end. Will you help him? No medications have worked. Nothing's worked. He's done sleep studies that the doctors gave up on him.
In his dreams, he sees cars blowing up, buildings blowing up,
People getting killed.
people getting shot. He's after them. They're after him.
A lot of nasty stuff. Hollywood would love it, that kind of thing. So we started talking to him, and we started asking him about his story. What happened? What are these dreams about? Kind of getting a feel for where he's coming from. And opening him up through the story and feeling those points that we were talking about. And we told him about the journaling, is what we call it, writing the story out. Because a lot of the problems that he was running into was his nightmares were open-looped. And as a result, he was getting more and more anxiety to going back to sleep because he didn't want to have those nightmares. He suffered from this for 7 years before we talked to him. 7 years of straight nightmares, no more than 30 minutes of sleep at night.
Most people's nightmares are open-looped. It's one of those things of where the monster never gets you. It's just right there, and you wake up. And that's an open loop. What happened?
You don't want to go back to bed after that, right? I mean, nobody wants to. So we told him, finish the story. When you wake up from that nightmare, journal it. Write the nightmare out. It's going to take, 15, 20 minutes to do probably, but write it out, everything you felt, everything you saw. And then from there, from the moment that you woke up, finish the story. Turn the monster into a puppy and cuddle with it or something, something that resonated with him, that fit him, that he wanted to see happen. And literally, in the span of 3 to 4 days of doing this, he went from 30 minutes of sleep a night to 3 hours. Huge jump. After a week, he was at 7 hours. 7 hours of sleep from 30 minutes of sleep. All by doing this journaling process, seeing the patterns in his dreams, seeing the open loops in his dreams, not only in his dreams, but also in his life. How this portrays to all the past events that he has had. And finishing those loops, closing those loops, and writing the stories the way that he wants it. He's almost at 8 hours of sleep at night now, straight, without waking up. Complete and total change.
And something that really helped was giving him a purpose beyond self. Because at this point, he's turned inward. This is horrible. I don't want to go to bed tonight. I don't even want to think of this. What is this? So it said, think of all the people. There are thousands of people out there that have transplants that are going through the exact same thing that you are. And there's no help for them. Psychiatrists haven't had a transplant like that. They can hand them some mumbo jumbo, but they don't feel it. They don't know it. They've not been through it, and they've not found a way back out of it. The doctors, they won't even let them know who this person was except, you know, maybe what they did, a little blurb here or there, but they don't let them contact the family. They don't let them close in this loop and find out anything. They need your help. You have a story to tell, and that story is going to have a good ending because you're going to beat this. And when you do, you will be able to heal so many people. And the last time we talked to him over there, his face was bright and shiny, and his handshake was good and firm again, where it had just been almost limp before.
He was
And he
a
said,
shell of a person when we first
Yeah.
met him.
He
And now
said-
he is energetic, he has got life in him, he's got purpose now.
And he said that. He said, it's for a good purpose. I'm starting to try to get in contact with people, and this is going to be good. It's made it into something worthwhile. It was just another dragon to slay on that journey, and he overcame it. And now then he has something to bring back to his people, to give to them.
So the reframing of the nightmare is all it took. Just to reframe the situation from being a victim to being a teacher, a student. This is teaching him something about himself, about what happened as a result of the cornea transplant. And as a result of that, he has become a teacher, a beacon of light for others that are trying to find a way through this. And I know this works because I can relate to him. That is why I was able to talk to him, was because I have nightmares like he does. And this is what has gotten me through.
If you haven't had an experience like the individual that you're talking to, then you have to get to that place where you can tap into them, where you can feel it. Don't block it off. They may block it off. It may hurt too much. But you can get in there and you can feel it. You can know it. And what you're doing when you do that is you're tapping into the last two directions on that medicine wheel, right in the center, the fifth and sixth directions, which is the earth and the Creator. And that's what all this is done through. It's one long prayer.
That's all stories are. They can be good prayers or they can be bad prayers. It depends on how they are framed and how they end, how you want them to end, what the intent is behind the story. Because even the worst story, the worst nightmare, which is, that's all dreams are stories. Well, not completely, but it all depends on the intent behind it. Something that may seem hideous and nasty may, you know, that's where the trickster stories come in. From mythology from around the world, you have the tricksters, the coyote, the turtle, Loki from Nordic mythology. All these tricksters, you know, were given, they cause trouble, they cause grief, but a lot of them, you know, in the Polynesian mythology, they were the ones that separated the sky from the earth and gave people the room to breathe and the tools to survive. Same with a lot of African mythology. The tricksters brought fire from the heavens. So something that may seem bad may not actually be bad. It may just be a change, one of the quarter directions, a rite of passage.
I think real quick, if I can remember it, I wrote a story a long time ago, so I don't know if I can remember it, but I think it's got a lot in it. There was a people that lived once long ago, and they lived very happily. They lived with nature, they lived with the land. And they would gather around the fires in the evening, and they would tell of a time long ago when this great bird ruled over the land, beautiful bird, and protected the people. And this was a time when only children ruled the earth. As soon as the people began to mature into adults, the bird disappeared. One day, one of their trackers was out hunting for the village. And he came back and he told the people, he said, I found these tracks, come see. He took them out and there was these huge footprints. They said, what is that? He said, it's a dragon. And it's too near our village. We need to try to trap this thing. So I said, okay. So all the villagers gathered together and they began putting together this trap. And they built it, big, huge trap. And then the tracker came in. He was the hunter, he was the master there at baiting and tracking. And he lined the inside of this trap with the softest down and put fruit in the other end of the cage. And on the other end, he hung a painting that looked like a beautiful meadow, a beautiful vista. Then all the people left and the tracker sat there and he began playing his flute. This most beautiful music came out and he started to draw the dragon in. The dragon came in sight and he saw the cage and he saw the fruit. And at first he was a little hesitant to step through the door, but the fruit looked so beautiful and the scene beyond it so enticing that he stepped into the cage and the door slammed behind him. And all the people, they thought, this is great. They breathed a sigh of relief. This thing is caged now. But its armor was so thick that they knew that none of their stone weapons would be able to pierce it. They couldn't kill it. So the only thing to do was to keep it in that cage. And so for generation after generation, this dragon stayed in the cage, and the parents would pass down the task of keeping it caged to their children. And a few people here and there would take pity on it and would throw it a few crumbs. And he sustained himself on that. Generations passed, and the children inherited this dragon from their parents. A time came when they were no longer making stone tools. Their knowledge had increased. They began making. What are we doing? Why are we still keeping this thing caged? Let's just kill it. We've got the tools now to do it. So the whole village gathered together. So they're still a bit scared of this thing. And they went out there. And they began to throw their spears through the bars of the cage. But every time that they struck that dragon, it didn't kill it. It grew bigger and bigger. And in desperation, they kept throwing their spears until it grew so big that it burst out of its cage. And then they thought, oh crap, what do we do now? And they all backed away. What do you do? It's standing there, it's wounded, and it's bigger than ever. And there was only one who stood up. It was a young girl. She had gone through her rites of passage. She was just at that stage of purity. But she knew what the warriors knew, and she carried a warrior's staff, a warrior's spear. And she stepped forward. And I said, no, you can't face him alone. She says, someone has to. And so she stepped forward, and she began to do battle with it. And for every wound that she inflicted on him, he wounded her twice. And her spear, he broke, and she reached for her sword. She wounded him and he broke her sword, and she reached for a knife. He knocked that out of her hand, and there was nothing left. And as he stood above her, she spread her arms and waited. And she felt at peace. There was no more fight. And the blood from both of their wounds flowed together into the sand. And as she stood there, he began to shrink. He grew smaller and smaller. Until finally, feathers sprung from him, and he flew up. And they recognized the bird and their ancient legends that had been told around the fire that had protected the children in those days when children ruled the earth. And he folded his wings about her, and the blood stopped flowing. I'm going to leave it open, look to that. No, that's the end of the story.
And you wrote that?
Any questions?
Any stories?
Any stories?
I don't think we can top that.
It's interesting how you mentioned that was it Africans that thought fire was something evil or bad when Native Americans considered fire a gift from the Creator.
They,
I don't remember Africans ever.
one of their tricksters brought fire down.
Yeah, trickster. Yeah, a gift from a
Well,
trickster.
That is an interesting point, because tricksters are often found in stories. But the trickster is not bad. The trickster is a teacher. And those of us in society who are tricksters are teachers. Even the one whom today we regard as the greatest trickster of all can be our greatest teacher.
Begins with an S, ends with a tan. God uses him for a reason. Otherwise he wouldn't have him around.
Thoughts? Stories? I know you're full of stories.
Ronnie used to be a great storyteller.
He still is.
Yeah.
A lot of stories. Joe Dan's a good storyteller too.
And some guy over here too, I think.
Yeah.
And Steve. Very good storyteller.
Look forward to hearing more.
Have a few.
And our historian who keeps our stories alive.
Okay, it's good.
So, you guys are done, I am.
Very good. Enjoyed it.